Okay, this case has been sent to us to evaluate the suitability for implant placement in site number 4 using an immediate technique. Um, let's take a look, and I think we would all agree that the restorability of tooth number 4 is questionable, and that an implant, that loss of the tooth is a very reasonable and expected thing. Now, of course, we can do endo, post-core, crown lengthening, full coverage restoration to try and salvage this tooth. But again, the submitting dentist has deemed this tooth not savable. So let's go ahead and move forward with our plan. And based on the plan that we've had submitted to us. So what I would like to do is begin by showing you my thought process of how I handle these immediate cases. So the first thing I often do with these immediates is I like to go ahead and outline what I'm dealing with. So here's our bone, just like so. And then I like to go ahead and outline our tooth, which is just like so. So based on this information, the first thing I notice is that the only area, and I'm going to put this in green so we can signify it as what I call the go zone, is right here. So this is the area that we can gain stability from our implant. Now again, this is just in the mesiodistal view now. We don't have the benefit of the buccal view to be able to see if there's mesiodistal engagement at this particular time. So we have that. The other thing that I can glean from this is that we have a very thin buccal plate. So in taking this tooth out, we're going to use periotomes to expand. We're not going to be leaning the tooth to the buccal and take a risk of breaking this buccal plate, because if we break the buccal plate, we have a whole new set of problems to deal with. So the other thing that I also know, because we have such a thin buccal plate, we're going to need to graft this case. In other words, I'm going to need to graft the gap that will be created. Now that's again assuming that we're able to place this implant. So in looking at this, is what we can see with this implant that has been planned is the areas that we're getting stability are these threads right here, and that's it. Okay, so based on that, I'm very questionable if we're going to get stability on this case or not. Again, it's a possibility, and what we can do is now we can switch over to looking at it buccolingually, and now when we look at it here, what we're starting to see is, hey, I'm going to get some thread engagement into fresh bone right from here down, okay, and that may work in our favor. But the question is that enough? So, I don't like to rely solely on that little bit of bone. So what I would look at is, can we go longer? Because when we go longer, now we're going to get more apical extension. We're going to have more bone on the buccal, so on the mesial here to engage. But now we bring into question this right here, this thinness that we're leaving. Now, is that too thin? Is that not thin enough? These are big questions, and the question I would have for you is, what happens if you take this tooth out, you do your osteotomy, and then we have a fenestration here? How are we going to handle it? Are we prepared to handle it? Many of us are very comfortable going and laying a flap all the way here. I mean, that's a very large flap that we have to lay to be able to graft that area, place a membrane, not place a membrane. We can argue about that. But these are things that we have to recognize. So then our option is, maybe I will tilt the tooth, tilt the implant like so. And now I have more space here, and now this is a lot of stability and more space. But what did this do? Now where's our implant coming out of? Now we're coming out of the buccal cusp. Is that proper loading for this implant? So where do we draw the line of compromising? And those are clinical decisions that I can't make for you. But my view of this is, instead of compromising ideal loading and ideal placement because we're uncomfortable with grafting, and that may not be the case. Everybody's a little bit different. My preference is to place the implant ideally. Place the implant in the right spot so that you have ideal long-term success from a loading perspective, and then simply flap and graft this area. Now, what happens when we flap and graft? does that bring other things into consideration, such as the thickness of the buccal plate? When we remove the periostea and the blood supply to that buccal plate, do we expect to have resorption of that? If that buccal plate is very thin to begin with, how are we going to handle that? So there are many things that we have to take into consideration here. So really the ability to do this is very dependent upon the system that you're using, the clinical skills that you have. The other thing I would say, and listen, again, I'm not against any implant systems, but here this is a relatively straight implant. So if we had more of a root form implant of the same size, would we be able to have more space right here? So for example, if I come here and change this to a NobelActive, which is the implant that I'm using mainly, now look at that. Because this is a tapered implant, we have more space here. Okay, and now we have more aggressive threads to engage. But now, will this work? So these are the bigger questions. So it's important to understand this. Will we have to graft this? My suggestion is that in this case, because of the thinness of the buccal plate, I would definitely place graft material between the implant and the buccal plate. Will we have enough stability for will we have enough bone for primary stability? I would plan to think so. What is the implant placement level? A lot of that depends on the bone level, and the bone level looks to be about right here. So this implant probably needs to go just a hair subcrestal. How long of an implant can we put in there? Can we get away with this length of an implant and get stability? Will we need to graft this apical area? Again, these are the big questions. So if we're uncomfortable with these items, my suggestion is either refer the case to a surgical, to someone comfortable with implant dentistry to do this case, or remove the tooth, graft the socket, and then come back. And what would be the only reason I would consider that is when I graft the socket, now instead of having, when I preserve the site and come back, now instead of having empty space here, this will be bone. And then more than likely we can get away with an implant this long even. Now we take this apical area out of consideration, we take the sinus out of consideration, and then we can suddenly start, almost going back where the root was here and get a even better position. Because this area where the tooth root was is now filled in with bone. So these are the things that we take into consideration. So hopefully this has been very helpful.